Пожалуй, в эпоху пандемии Zoom стал одной из важнейших.
During the pandemic, Zoom has probably become one of the most important platforms for online education, but will it be able to replace the traditional platform of knowledge universities? The professor from Harvard Higher School of Education, Christopher DEDE, manager from International Association of Universities, Jensen, and deputy of the Parliament of the Republic from Azerbaijan, SABAH Group, SEIDZADE Shahin, with the moderator Uliana. Zurich will start the discussion on the future of educational system, where it's going to, and whether remote education will be able to provide social pillars for the students. Let's go.
Good afternoon, everyone, but also good morning and good evening to all participants currently watching us from all around the world. My name is Uliana FURIV, joining you from Ukraine. A few words about myself. I am a project officer at the International Institute of Educational Planning of UNESCO, or IIEP UNESCO, based in Paris, France. And for the past 2 years, I have been coordinating research on flexible learning pathways in higher education, which I will share with you shortly to kick off our discussion. So today it is my honor and great pleasure to chair a discussion at the Central Asian Nobel Fest, which brings together remarkable speakers to discuss this relevant but also provocative topic: Zoom versus universities. Where are we heading, and what is the future of remote learning? I hope that we managed to find some answers to these, in my opinion, not so easy questions, because one thing that this crisis has shown to us is that we cannot really plan so confidently and plan long-term perspective about the future. And we should perhaps try to be more agile, maybe flexible, if you will, as planners. So before we start off our discussion, let me first introduce our excellent speakers. It is truly an international panel with quite complementary backgrounds. So let me first move to the US, introduce you to Dr. DEDE, who is a Timothy E. Wirth professor in learning technologies at Harvard Graduate School in Education. His fundamental interest is in developing new types of educational systems to meet the opportunities and challenges of the 21st century. His research is in emerging technologies for learning, infusing technology into large-scale educational improvement initiatives, developing policies that support educational transformation, and providing leadership in educational innovation. Good to have you here, Dr. DEDE. Then let's move to Denmark. I would like to introduce you to Trine Jensen, to my UNESCO fellow colleague. Trine is a manager of higher education and digital transformation, publication and events at the International Association of Universities. Before, she worked for the Bureau for Strategic Planning at UNESCO headquarters for 7 years. And currently, she is in charge of IU events and strategic priority on digital transformation of higher education. Welcome, Trine. And last but not least, let's move to Azerbaijan. Let me welcome Shahin SEIDZADE, who is a member of Parliament of the Republic of Azerbaijan, director of SABAH. In 2012-2016, he was the chairman of the National Council of Youth Organizations of the Republic of Azerbaijan. He was also a member of the supervisory board of the Youth Foundation under the president of the Republic of Azerbaijan. He is also the head of the executive committee of the Social Projects Competition, which is implemented by the Regional Development Public Union of the Ministry of Education of the Republic of Azerbaijan. So welcome, Shahin. Before we proceed to the main discussion, I would like to first explain to you how we will run the session. Our main discussion will last for about 30 minutes, moderated by me. And then we will move to a 10-15 minute discussion with hopefully, actually I'm confident about interesting questions from the audience. So let us start. I will share my short presentation to kick off our discussion. Yes, hopefully you can see the presentation. So to kick off our discussion, I would like to make a short presentation about IIEP's approach to flexible learning and to how we see a future of higher education, how we see higher education trying to address the issues of planning in the context of this uncertainty and fragility. So when discussing about the future of universities and the future of teaching and learning, it is perhaps important to reflect about the context that we are currently in. More than a year ago, we have entered into a crisis that is still ongoing. The scale of COVID-19 pandemic has been unprecedented in the 21st century. Just to remind our audience, as of March 2020, higher education was disrupted worldwide. Most universities and colleges started to close down their campuses, which affected students worldwide. It in fact affected more than 220 million students at the peak of the pandemic. Most institutions moved to remote teaching and learning. Some were simply forced to close down, and actually only a few in the beginning could continue as usual. And vulnerable students were hardest hit, as many were not equipped with computers and internet access. Also, institutions lacked infrastructure for that. And international students were also stranded in host countries, often not knowing when they will return to their home countries. Now that we are 1 year into the pandemic and it is no longer the same situation of emergency mode, we have had the time perhaps to put in place some mechanisms. From my work, I personally have been impressed to see to what extent universities around the world have been able to respond and find solutions to continue their operations. The ongoing crisis has indeed highlighted the need for flexible higher education systems that provide diverse learning pathways in support both of equity but also lifelong learning. So when we think of flexible learning, we refer to flexible learning that is a process of learning where a learner can choose how, where, when, and what of learning through different means, through technology-enhanced learning, through flexible pedagogical approaches, through flexible institutional structure. It is a process where learning and teaching is increasingly freed from the limitations of time, pace, and pace of study. So even before the pandemic, IIEP has started to research flexibility in higher education, and we launched a project in 2018, Flexible Learning Pathways in Higher Education. We did a literature analysis where we clarified concepts and definition of what actually is flexible learning and what are flexible learning pathways. Then we did an international survey with all UNESCO member states to understand what are the factors that facilitate and what are the barriers that impede the implementation of flexible learning pathways in higher education institutions. And lastly, we did 8 in-depth country case studies to understand the effectiveness of flexible learning pathways in the countries mentioned in the slide. So in our research, we define flexible learning pathways as entry, but also re-entry points for students at all educational levels that strengthen the links between non-formal, but also formal education structures, and that focus on the validation and recognition of knowledge and skills and competencies that are required in diverse types of settings, both formal, informal, and non-formal. And it is also a way that students, it is a way for students to gain qualification to transition to the labor market or continue their studies. So we understand flexible learning pathways as divided into 3 stages: flexible learning pathways for getting into, but also getting through and getting out of higher education. In this presentation, we will mainly focus on flexible learning pathways to get through higher education. It is particularly relevant in the current context as open and distance learning mode became the major mode of delivering learning on in this current state of the pandemic, and it is no longer the add-on that used to be used by some universities. So open and distance learning is really a flexible pathway that enables flexibility in terms of location, but also in terms of pace of study. But it also is a great equity tool as it aims to expand access to education and enable continuous learning opportunities for diverse types of students, for rescaling, but also further study. So we have learned in our research many lessons from the current context now that distance learning is a key mode of educational delivery. We learned that one of our case countries, India, has a particularly interesting policy framework that has favored the development of open distance learning programs by open universities through national platforms for online courses like this platform called Swayam. India offered distance education as a major alternative mode of delivery long before the arrival of the pandemic. It has currently 15 open universities, 110 dual mode universities. And during the pandemic, the government has also allowed top 100 India's universities to provide degrees fully online. And this has been the same trend in many other countries where online and distance learning becomes a very important delivery tool of learning. Another case country that we explored was Finland, and it also has effective online system that has been created before COVID, but has been also actively used during COVID. It's this system called Open Studies. It's a platform that is offered by most public higher education institutions in Finland, where the courses are offered by more than 20 Finnish universities free of charge, and they can be recognized in students' degrees. So open studies provide opportunities for continuous education, but also for upscaling, for working adults, upgrading personal competencies. And they are offered through multiple modes as evening, weekend, but also in this time of pandemic and distance or remote learning courses. And such studies have the same content, but and also requirements as traditional programs in public higher education institutions. Independent from this pandemic, we can see that new ways of learning are acquiring skills already engage millions of learners worldwide. Offering more higher education, more flexible higher education in terms of delivery, but also pacing of higher education has been instrumental during the pandemic to ensure that higher education institutions empower students by offering them choices. However, we also noticed that during the pandemic, many higher education institutions struggle to ensure flexibility. With this, I would like to turn to our discussion and invite our panelists to reflect. So what are your thoughts about the challenges and some opportunities about the future of education? How this great social experiment in the use of digital technologies that allow flexibility in higher education will actually impact higher education institutions. Perhaps we can start off with Dr. DEDE. He will share with us a presentation, The Future of Universities 60-Year Curriculum. Dr. DEDE, the screen is yours.
So thank you for inviting me to share ideas. And I'm going to talk about an initiative that is happening in many divisions of continuing education, and that deals with the content of what universities should be teaching for the years ahead. So where does the 60 years come from? In adolescence, typically is when young people start thinking seriously about their careers. And this next generation, even with the pandemic, is likely to live into its 90s or over a century. So people are going to need to work into their 70s to not run out of money. And that's 6 decades. So for 6 decades, we need to think about learning as a continuous thing rather than something that happens once, largely at the beginning of your career, and then you have the same job throughout. But the other thing that's happening is the curriculum part. We are facing a very turbulent half century coming up. And this was all developed before the pandemic. So the pandemic is just the tip of the iceberg. Climate change, the failure to attain the UN sustainability goals, shifts in the division of labor, and advances in technology are all driving different kinds of disruptive changes in work, in the economy, in civics, and in education. And at the same time, we have billions of people connected by mobile devices and social media with internet access, which greatly accelerates the pace of change. So every aspect of work, citizenship, and life is going to change, and then change again, and then change again, often disruptively. One of the big factors in this is the advance of artificial intelligence and machine learning. And there are many reports that stress the fact that jobs are going to disappear and people are going to have to be reskilled for different jobs. But the much bigger impact is actually the jobs that remain will be shared between a smart machine and a person. And under those circumstances, there's a couple things that can happen. One of them is that the machine takes over much of the job. So for example, as a university teacher, I work with an artificial intelligence specialist who builds experts to help university teaching. There's a question answering expert and a tutoring expert and a library expert and a laboratory expert and a social expert and a evaluation expert. And in the future, I and others will be surrounded by experts like that. Now, that could be a very bad future if all those experts take over the job and kind of order me around on what to do that they can't do. Or that could be a very bright future in which the agents do the simpler parts of teaching and free up the human being to do the deep, wise, human-centered parts of teaching. So what we're faced with is upskilling people to meet these disruptive challenges, including artificial intelligence, that have the promise to make work more interesting and powerful, but also have the threat, if we don't succeed in education, of preparing people to be de-skilled. The other part about the 60-year curriculum that's important to recognize is that we need to think about not just knowledge and skills as part of what we inculcate in students, but also dispositions, tendencies, part of people's characters. We've seen in the pandemic that people with equal skill levels, equal knowledge, may behave in very different ways. Some people are paralyzed by the disruption. They don't know what to do. Their familiar patterns have disappeared, and they're depressed and stuck. Other people are empowered by the pandemic. They see the opportunity for innovation. And I co-founded an initiative called Silver Lining for Learning, in which we're collecting stories from all across the world of educators whose innovation has been freed by the pandemic to come up with new ideas and new approaches. The major difference between people who are paralyzed and people who are freed is not knowledge and skills, it's dispositions. Being flexible, being resilient, having confidence in your own ideas, taking the initiative, seizing leadership. And we need to make sure that that's part of our education in the future, because that's the world that this next generation and all of us as adults are going to be facing. So I want to close by just talking about a very important question that every organization needs to ask frequently, which is, what business are we in? And in our book, The 60-Year Curriculum, we talk about this. I live about 90 miles north of a town in which there are wonderful historic mansions, very, very fancy mansions that were built a century ago by people who had made a fortune in the railroads in the United States. Within 20 years of when they were built, those mansions were deserted and those fortunes had collapsed. And the reason for that is that those rich people did not understand what business they were in. They thought they were in the railroad business, but they were really in the transportation business. And so the advent of the automobile and the airplane hammered those fortunes. We are not anymore in the education business. We're not in the classroom business. We're not in the campus business. We're not in the course and degree business. We're in the lifelong learning business. And flexible learning is a terrific way of thinking about how we're going to succeed in the lifelong learning business. So I hope those ideas are of interest, and I look forward to our discussion.
Yes, thank you very much, Dr. DEDE. Perhaps we will take questions a little bit later, and this was a very interesting and inspiring presentation. I already noted down a lot of questions that I would like to address to you, but I will move to our next speaker, Trina. IIU works extensively with institutions, so your institution knows very well what is happening on the ground. So perhaps you could share with us some of your thoughts about how institutions are transforming, how they have been transformed, and what would be the future in your opinion. I mean, we cannot probably guess too far in the future, but what are your thoughts about this?
Thank you very much, and thank you for bringing me into this very important conversation. IIU is very pleased to take part. Just to put into context, the International Association of Universities is a membership-based organization, and we're very pleased to celebrate 70 years this year, since we were created by UNESCO in 1950. So we are grouping, of course, universities from around the world to come together for exchange. And in my reflections on this first question that was posed as part of this panel on educational system, the first thing I was thinking was that we have to put it into plural, because of course the world is composed of very different countries and we have to respond to the different context of the world. But there are indeed things that are common challenges. And I think, Uliana, you already touched some, and Chris as well. The fact that we are not necessarily on a sustainable track right now. We are not necessarily operating in a sustainable fashion. We have to think differently in terms of sustainable development. This was already a huge issue before the pandemic, and now we find ourselves in the midst of a worldwide health crisis with the pandemic. As you say, Uliana, this has really led us to see to what extent universities have been able to respond and pivot in order to ensure that the work of academia was not disrupted, but continued through different ways of working. I'm mentioning these more general crises because I think that this is an important role that university has to respond to these global challenges of our time. I believe that knowledge, education, and learning are the key to the humanity in order to find solutions to these common global challenges of our time. So that is why I believe that when we think about educational systems, we have to see the higher education systems as an investment in the future, as an investment in our citizens, in order to be able to address the challenges that we have, and not necessarily as an expenditure. So the system, to me, is more than the mode of learning. This is, I know, the key topic of this session. And I'm also going to, that brings me to the topic of the session, which I found very interesting, Zoom versus university. So let me just comment briefly on that, because I think that it's a very interesting title, because Zoom in itself, for me, is an empty tool. It's a tool that you use to communicate. Like other tools, it could be a phone, a walkie-talkie, you have different, but in itself, it holds no knowledge, no guidance, no structure, and no learning path. Universities, on the other hand, whether it's within a country or globally, they are a pillar of society, a pillar of knowledge, of formation, of exploration, of academic freedom, where you can think and pursue truth, discovery without interference. They are complex institutions, but they are indeed not empty. So, and on top of that, they also, in many cases, provide a social space for the community to meet, to exchange ideas, to develop as individuals, and to make a community thrive. So if you ask me what to choose between Zoom and universities, I think that for the sake of humanity, I will choose the university. However, Zoom I see as an important part of universities. I think that it is a tool that we use to communicate. It is a tool that we have seen is an essential way of being able to pursue learning in a time of pandemic. So I think that we should bring Zoom and other similar platforms into the university in order to create different types of learning spaces. And I hope that we will continue these different modes of learning moving forward, but I also hope that we will continue to have social interactions as human beings. So this is my response to your first question, and hopefully I'll get back to some of the other questions as well. Thank you, Uliana.
Thank you, Trian. This was indeed a very thought-provoking presentation, and I already have also a lot of questions. I particularly am interested in what kind of investments you would see in higher education and where this investment is needed. But before we proceed to the questions, I will introduce our last but not least speaker, Shahin, to share his thoughts about the future of education and where are we heading? Shahin, the screen is yours.
Hello?
Yes, we can hear you.
Yes. Hello. Good day. It's honorable for me to be a part of this event. I would like to greet to all experts. I also would like to tell big organization committee an event. And as I'm member of Parliament of Azerbaijan Public Education Committee in Paris, the member of the group which are working on the Higher Education Act. I'm also continuing my study in PhD. And at the same time, I am team members of SABAH project. Just brief information about SABAH. SABAH is the future. And SABAH is united for 12 universities with 2,300 students. With a high talent government university, and at the end of the first course, we have selected the best students. Syllabus, the lecture selected job market, and SABAH project is a government project, and final. And it's one of the initiative of Ministry of Education. It's just education for high talent students. What about diploma and graduate certificate? Content. What about the lectures? It's managed by Ministry of Education. And from starting 51 universities closes the doors for around 200,000 students in Azerbaijan. From March 2020, higher education is absolutely online. From February of this year, with education started to study an offline format. But today's Zoom are our realities. That is good. It's not a question for today's. The question is what's the new trend, what is the new challenge, and what's the new approach we'll have in the future. And can you show the presentation? Yes.
Yes, if you are sharing it, you can share it in the slide mode.
1 second, please.
Mm-hmm.
Yes. 1 second, please. And yes. Now it's fine.
Maybe it's coming. I cannot see it yet. So we see your presentation. We only don't see it in the slide mode. It's in the bottom of the screen to your right. And there's this icon.
1 second, please.
Yeah.
1 second, please. Sorry. Just. Yes.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, you can. Yes, perfect.
Thank you. Yes, just a brief presentation and just observation. What do you have to do with this pandemic area? And the distance learning, it means that the location of important. It's not important to move the place of getting an education. It's have more for getting more quality. Azerbaijan united more 70 administrators with their own. In more 10. Distance learning is a good approach. Not living. And of course, that the cost saving. It means that the expense of infrastructure will be much more invested in infrastructure, more money will be invested in. And of course, in ICT. It's more important the building. It's more important. What about that? The one of the more important highlights. What about education? Will come in age generation. They will have as a new life skills, as a eating, as a book reading, the skills of social media are making our life online. Area of making the education for rather there are many discussions on it's better, it's good, but it's reality. Just I would just short story about my children. I have one small daughter and older son. My son is 15. And my daughter has a preschool. And I was observing two babies the same time. My son wants to go to school, want to be a part of community, to environment. My daughter, from 1st September, just the first time where she go online to the school, and she doesn't understand what is meant of the school. And every day, opens the computer and she's thinking that she's now in the school. And really that there is a big difference between that age generation and my son who used to go to days. And really that what happened in 5 years, but it's a real fact that it's a age generation. What about one of the bad sides is the elitizing of the education. From one side, the learning process will be accessible, but from the other side, the rising university will be making the cost more expensive. Because that is a big balance between quality and price. And what about neutral? What that is new challenge of the computer? The teaching process will be requesting new skills and communication between online. As a resume, I want to make some highlights of my presentation. One of the very sensitive making decision in education, not quick, very, and it's absolute sense very and pandemic or pandemic, sometimes it's a quick decision and this transition process. We cannot predict the outcomes of this pandemic area because of today's sustainability is what and of course in my experience everything is just research, just very, but within 10 years and 20 years that it will be really experience for education area on the global level. And all prediction now are really that we can see some trends. One is that historical fact we that we don't know what was education in higher education system in post-war. And of course, after the global change with the national reaction, it depends on national, but we have as a global gap. It's already not the old one, it's a fact, but we are not sure what is the mission.
Thank you, Shahin.
Thank you very much.
So, yes, thank you to all speakers. These were indeed very insightful presentations, and we seem to all agree that technology is here to stay, and higher education institutions have already incorporated a lot of flexible modes of designing and delivering content, which of course has increased access to higher education for many students. Now students can benefit from open distance learning opportunities, lecturers, educators, researchers can connect through platforms that were unforeseen before. Yet, of course, there's still a lot of concern about the experience of online learning that Trina has touched upon. Whether online education can really provide this social interaction between students. And I have read today an article that calls this current generation of students Generation Z or Zoomers, and refers to them as generation that has different interests and different needs to previous generations, and that they want to learn by doing, they want to receive immediate feedback, but they also crave autonomy to decide what to learn and how to learn, to demonstrate their knowledge. So they crave and require a lot more flexibility. So my question to you, dear panelists, is how can institutions firstly nurture the students' values and passions in the new post-COVID form of hybrid learning, and at the same time provide high-quality higher education degree? How can these two be combined? Digital learning, but also high-quality social experience. Perhaps I will start with Chris.
So I want to differentiate between Zoom and online learning. Zoom was never designed to be a learning platform. It turned out to be the best quick way of responding to a crisis. When I think about online learning, I think about social media and I think about internet games. Both of those are intensely social experiences that for many people, even before the pandemic, may have played as large a role or a larger role than their face-to-face interactions. So really, when we talk about social, Zoom is the wrong platform. I don't know of a single young person who says, I want to get in touch with my friends. Let's set up a Zoom call. Of course not. They use social media. They use internet games. And as we develop this lifelong, life-wide, life-deep, flexible learning, we don't want to set up something that's outside of people's experience and say, hey, if you want to learn, you have to come here. We need things that are much more like internet game platforms for active learning by doing with collaboration and sharing. We need things that are much more like social media in which people can have voice and choice. So the problem isn't online. The problem is that we think Zoom somehow is online, and universities are now agonizing about how to do education on Zoom. So it's the wrong question, really, is the point that I want to make.
What do you think, how can institutions incorporate these social elements in their learning and their pedagogies?
Well, I in my teaching, I have had students play a game, 64 students simultaneously over Zoom, which is kind of a mess, called Among Us, which is very popular during the pandemic, and because it's about a hidden killer. And so a lot comes out. We've played a game called Gris, which is about loss and going through the stages of grief. We have examined a system called Classcraft, which is a way of using World of Warcraft-like options to motivate students to move through the stages of classroom academic learning. So there's a lot out there. But what we have to do is to understand that distance learning is not an informal, it's not an inferior form of classroom learning. It's an orange. It's not a bad apple. And you can say, well, wait a minute, I can't make orange pies. No, but you can make orange juice. So we really need to invent remote learning using the powerful media we already have that we know work for non-academic learning, and then complement that with face-to-face learning.
Thank you, Chris. Maybe Trina, you have some thoughts about that?
Yes, thank you, Uliana. Yes, I think it's a matter, I mean, for me, in my opinion, of course, the future is blended. I agree with Chris. I think that it will be an integration of different modes of learning. And I also fully agree with him. I do not qualify one as being better than the others. They are different types of learning, and they are complementary, and they offer different opportunities to different types of learners. I think, though, that in terms of the young students that we have, because I fully agree with Chris that we are in a time where we continue to learn throughout life. But I do think that we have a specific need for students that transition from secondary education to universities, and universities do represent some kind of a transition where you go from education and learning to work and learning. And therefore, I think that particularly in this group, I think there's still need for face-to-face, but I think that we have to think differently about face-to-face. I think we should not group thousands of people together in the same auditorium and do a lecture where we have no conversation. I think those would actually be better filmed and provided to students so that they can hear it maybe several times or listen to the parts that they find more interesting more than once, instead of just being in a room with a lot of people where you cannot talk. I think that the face-to-face need to be different. It needs to be a space where we discuss, where we have the chance to do presentation, where we exchange opinions, where we learn to interact and find solutions, and not just a place where you receive knowledge put at you, because I think that's not the generation of today. They learn how to learn, but they still need those spaces where they come together for exchange. I think that the pandemic has taught us that you see the mental health issues that we have. Humans are social beings. So I think that for the quality of life, I think that we should continue to have spaces where we meet and we discuss, and then we use the technology to gain access to information and knowledge through different types of technologies and tools. So I think that we need both modes moving forward. Thank you.
And yes, Trina, you mentioned that higher education is an investment. So my final question to you would be, what investment is needed? Where this investment is needed?
Well, my comment from that came from the fact that, of course, being part of this pandemic, we see that we will also have an economic crisis, we have a social crisis, and in those types of contexts, it's a matter of prioritizing the funds moving forward. And this is where I just wanted to make the case that I think that investing in higher education, in education, is really a crucial priority for the states moving forward if we want to develop solutions for the challenges that we are facing. So it's not necessarily in one specific domain, but I do see, as an international association of universities, we do see the complete different context. Like some countries in Europe have received enormous investments on top of their normal budgets in order to pivot, and other countries around the world has to do with maybe less to then pivot. So we have huge types of inequalities taking place right now. So it is not a one-size-fits-all solution, but I think that in general, for all countries, investing in higher education is important for our future.
Thank you. Shahin, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, absolutely. And but first we should that to find an answer to this question: what is with quality of education? Quality education, it's a result or it's the process. And if it's a quality education, it's a result, but it's more important, and absolutely agree. My colleagues would try that self-education is more important. And if you're just taking an attention that one of the objectives of higher education is to develop researching skills of the learners, and researching skills will lead to students to be more educated. It's out of internet and online. Of course, that it's absolutely not apple to apple, that offline and online education. It's absolutely different way and absolutely different result. But we have it today. Today we have the realities, and we should that to find more different, more flexible tools for just a change and for supporting the learners. And it's important that, of course, that what are the competence that who is the student today? The students is the learners and not enough. And one of the absolutely that I agree with Chris, that it's more important that gamification, different interactive process, and it's more important to organize small groups practice. But again, that it's not that absolutely the same. And distance learning, online education, Zoom, it's really tools, not more. And it's more important to think about offline education.
Thank you, Shahin. I will perhaps take one question from the audience. We're running out of time, unfortunately. So the question sounds as follows. Should we pay more attention to students' mental health in these uncertain times? Online learning is quite isolating because it does not have the same social aspect after all. Does anyone would like to respond to this?
I think it depends on the age of the student. Do you feel in work with a mixture of remote work and face-to-face work that the workers remotely are facing a mental health crisis? I don't think that that's the case. In fact, a lot of people are saying, I don't want to go back to face-to-face work all the time. I like having some time working from home. So for adults, I don't think it is a mental health crisis. On the other hand, young children, sure. And perhaps children who are leaving high school and going to college and looking forward to campus and all the social activities and athletics, then it's a crisis perhaps for them. But we need to move away from the idea that being online is a mental health crisis. Do I believe that being on Zoom all the time is a mental health crisis? Absolutely, but not being online necessarily.
Thank you, Chris. Trina, any thoughts?
Yeah, I think that we, as an association, we're also monitoring the impact of the pandemic on higher education. And we did see in our first survey that this is actually key priorities that are coming up for the university. So I think that they are doing a lot in order to provide extra support to students in this specific situation. And maybe I can just make a call to those universities who are listening right now. We have our second global survey taking place right now. So do go to our website and do explain how you have been responding to the situation, because it's important to have this global understanding of the impact on higher education. And there we also have questions around mental health. So we look forward to sharing that publication with you later.
Thank you to all the panelists. With this, I would like to close the discussion. Once again, I would like to thank our speakers for their excellent ideas and for their excellent presentations. I think that we have come to the conclusion that while digital learning has appeared before the pandemic, it has really come to the forefront during the pandemic period, and most likely it is here to stay. And I think that we can expect that when campuses return to some state of normalcy, blended learning will be the way. So the future for many institutions will be both online and on-campus learning, as a social element is really important for students, but also for staff. So now I guess it's a perfect opportunity for us, for policymakers, for educators, for researchers, for students to investigate and research best practice framework that would work for everyone in the future. So I hope that our conversations will, of course, continue beyond this discussion. And I would like to thank the Central Asian Nobel Fest for providing us with this platform for great exchange. So thank you all and goodbye.